Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Nick. This week I had a request from my mom to make this dog dish holder for a puppy that she recently got. If you guys want to see how I made it, stick around. I had a piece of S4S oak that was sitting in my basement for the last probably 7 or 8 years. That was going to be perfect for this project. The one end had a little bit of water damage, so I just made sure that I avoided that area. I began the project by taking it over to my miter saw and cutting a couple pieces to length. Being this piece of oak was surfaced on all 4 sides, I still took it over to the joiner to make sure that the edges where I was going to glue it up were nice and square. I could then take the dog dishes and just kind of lay them out. I didn't want to have to glue up 3 boards, and this was kind of a tight squeeze, but everything ended up working out. After getting the diameter of the bowls figured out, I could then adjust my compass accordingly and lay out 2 circles. At this point, I have it in clamps, but it's not glued up. That way I could bring it over to the bandsaw rather than use the jigsaw to cut out the semicircles. Once I had all 4 of those pieces cut out, I then brought it over to some clamps, applied some glue to the remaining edges, and clamped everything up nice and tight, all while keeping an eye on the surface to make sure everything was nice and flat and even. I also added a clamp in the middle just in case. The few other remaining parts, I just edge glued those and threw those in some clamps as well and waited for the glue to dry. Using a damp rag, I could remove any glue squeeze out. Then taking a piece of non-corrugated cardboard from a product box, I could then just hand sketch in the leg detail. Nice little tip is, just draw half of it in, cut that half out, and then fold it over, and you can cut out the remaining side to make sure they're nice and symmetrical. Once the top was out of the clamps, I could bring it over to my oscillating spindle sander and sand it down to the line and make sure everything was nice and smooth. At this point, I didn't necessarily sand it so that the bowls fit completely flat in the opening, because I knew that they were tapered towards the top, and I was going to add a 1/4 inch round over with my trim router. That made the opening slightly larger towards the top, then the bowls were able to sit nice and flush in the opening. The glue up went pretty good, and I could just use a card scraper to finesse the glue line to make sure everything was nice and smooth. And then squared up one of the edges and cut the 2 side pieces to length. Using the pattern I cut earlier, I could then just trace the side profile, bring it over to the bandsaw, make a relief cut in the center, then cut the 2 remaining halves free. Using my 1-inch belt sander, I could then sand everything nice and smooth to the line for the exterior curves, and for the interior curves, brought it back to my oscillating spindle sander and smoothed everything all out. At this point, I mocked everything up, and I wasn't quite happy with it. It didn't necessarily look right to my eye. So I brought the sides back to the table saw and cut them quite a bit shorter, then also cut a little bit off the width. I also finalized the length to the top at this point. Then I could just mock everything up, and this looked a whole lot better. Sometimes with projects you got to do that. You know, on paper it might look good one way, but all of a sudden you get it together and it just doesn't look proportionate. Taking the top over to my router, I just eased the edge and added a little bit of a decorative profile. Then it was on to a little bit of sanding, everybody's favorite part of the project. I didn't want to see any type of fasteners visible, so I just used my biscuit joiner to cut a couple slots into the legs, and then marked out the locations in the underside of the top and cut some biscuit slots in those as well. This isn't the strongest joint in the world, end grain to face grain, but with the biscuits in place, this is just a dog dish holder. It's not going to see any type of racking or any type of heavy use. In this case, it'll be just fine. Once everything fit nice, then I could add some glue, add the biscuits, and a couple clamps. I also saved some of the offcuts from the leg detail earlier. I could then use that in place to also clamp the middle. Then it's just a matter of repeating the same process on the other side. Once everything was out of the clamps, I then took another offcut from when I cut the semicircles earlier and screwed it to a board so that I could bring it over to my table saw and put a small bevel on the straight edge of this piece. This was going to act as somewhat of a name plate. I also cut this to the same shape as my leg profile and added the same routed detail that I had on the top. Sometimes with different routed profiles, it's hard to sand them. I often find that a permanent marker with some sandpaper wrapped around it has a nice little contour on the edge and you can get into all the little nooks and crannies. You don't have to use a bright pink marker, but I found that these work the best. I didn't want to necessarily wait for the glue to dry, so I just used some 2p10 adhesive and some activator to glue the nameplate in place. Within about 20 or 30 seconds, it was solid. Now if I could only choose what paint colors to use to paint on the name.
Light blue and dark purple.
Something I found really cool was my son actually picked out the colors and he ordered the paint all by himself. And something I always got to remind myself that I take for granted that I can just go up to a paint counter and I know exactly how to do it. He had never ordered paint before, so it's a nice teaching experience. I told him, I said, just go up there with your swatch, tell him what size container you wanted, and he took care of the rest. The guy said to give him a couple minutes, but my son just sat there and waited. Like I said earlier, this is going to be for my mom's new puppy, and my mom likes things hand done, and my kids were going to paint this, so I just kind of sketched in with a pencil the dog's name, cut it out with a nice sharp knife, and that way it acted as a really cool stencil to where my kids could paint it. They sure did have a fun time actually painting the name on. Oddly enough, I find young kids really like to paint. Once the paint was fully dry, I could just remove the tape. What I like to do is then just sand it lightly to take some of the sharp edges off, and then use a little bit of compressed air to get the paint dust out of all the pores of the wood. The finish that I chose for this, being there was going to be water nearby, is a wipe-on polyurethane, but I didn't want to necessarily wipe over the paint. I didn't want to smear it, so I just sprayed a real quick light coat of spray lacquer so that the paint was nice and sealed. Then I could just proceed on to putting on 3 or 4 coats of wipe-on polyurethane. Well, with animals around anything new, she's a bit skeptical of it, but I'm sure she'll warm up to it. And it's a little bit big for her now, but I know she'll grow into it. Where did the name Elsa come from? Well, when my mom said that she was getting a puppy, she told my kids that they could name the dog. So apparently it's from, I don't know, some movie. Not really quite sure. Well, until I see you guys next time, you guys, take care.
Do you want to build a snowman?
Why don't you want to help her build a snowman? It's fun to build things.